All right, let's get going. So, hey everyone, and welcome to the October version of the Cerini Connection, where we'll be discussing with Jarrid Pearson, who's the Director of Learning and Development at PuzzleHR, some strategies for effective employee development. I mean, that's one of the biggest things that we're seeing out there, one of the critical issues. A lot of our clients are talking about how do we attract, retain, and motivate employees. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking a little bit about today and kind of move things along. If people do have questions as we're going through this, I ask if you can please put those questions in the chat and I will work those questions into the conversation where possible. So first of all, Jarrid, really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Ken. I really look forward to this.
So before we get started, maybe you can talk a little bit about or briefly describe how PuzzleHR, what PuzzleHR does and how it works with companies.
Yes, absolutely. So we're in October, so I can officially start talking spooky stuff. So I'll start with PuzzleHR takes the horror out of HR. Let's face it, HR can be a really scary atmosphere, right? So what PuzzleHR does is we don't focus on replacing HR departments or becoming just that outsourced solution and you say, bye-bye, I don't need to deal with this. Instead, we partner with organizations for everything across full scope of HR, payroll, learning and development, HCM system conversions, optimizations, recruiting, benefits administration, essentially anything under that HR umbrella, PuzzleHR can help with and partner to drive something that really drives cultural change versus check the box, I have this done.
Awesome. Let's start with, I guess, one of the biggest issues that we're seeing out there. I mean, we're hearing more and more that leadership is super important, that people don't work for companies anymore. They actually work for leaders, and that's what keeps people tied to organizations and companies. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing out there as some of the leadership challenges that businesses are currently facing, and maybe what steps they should do in order to overcome some of those challenges?
Yeah, Ken, that's a really good question. So there's a few different directions I can go. So I'll give a few approaches here. Number one of the biggest challenges we see out there amongst leadership today is poor communication. Now, it's a really tough pill to swallow with that because you hear, I'm not communicating or not communicating the right way. And immediately we try to get defensive as leaders. And with poor communication, you may think you're doing great, but there's just so many different communication styles across the board for people, where one person wants to be communicated one way, there's another for another person. In communication, it's all about being clear, concise, and effective. Additionally, making sure people understand what you're communicating. Give the room for your folks to be able to ask those questions and gain clarity on what you're trying to tell to them. The more clear everything is and the more direction folks can see your organization or your communication coming from, the better off people are going to be able to understand and move that needle forward. Another really big portion of this, and one of my passions in leadership and has been for many years now, is employee engagement and retention efforts. So in organizations, we get so caught up in the day-to-day activities, I need to do this, this is on fire over here, how do I make sure this works the right way? And those are necessary evils in companies, but we may lose out on the positives of, hey, this is where you're doing a really good job. Here's how we engage you. Here's how we say, this is where you can step into this situation, and here's how you can really drive change for the organization or drive success for this client. In doing those things and connecting your employees to what they're doing, there's a true sense of purpose behind it. And when you have a sense of purpose, you'll have a higher degree of retention because people feel important and they belong. And I'd be remiss to not talk about the last one in my head right now, which is inadequate leadership development. If you're not properly developing your leaders to handle the situations that come their way and not understanding that not everyone that comes into leadership really has that full scope of services, then we're doing an injustice to the leaders and the teams that report to them. So giving that proper development for leaders and having that tool bag to really go in and make those right decisions and the people first decisions that are necessary, it helps to move that forward and resolve some of those organizational leadership problems that we currently see.
So there are multiple paths, as you said, you went down. So I'm going to actually pivot and go down a couple of those paths. Hopefully I don't hit a rabbit hole here, but you talked about communication style and the fact that there are different communication styles. And I think what we find is a lot of times people don't understand and they try to communicate the way they feel is effective without understanding who they're communicating to and what's effective for the person they're communicating to. How do you best understand what someone's communication style is, and how do you bridge that gap?
Really good question on that one as well. So there's, again, a few different rabbit holes we could go down for this one. Let's just take a look at some of the basics that pop up as really shining stars overall. One of those things that I always try to do for any person that ever reports directly to me or encourage leaders to do is have that conversation at the very start of the relationship. Spoiler, if you haven't already had the conversation, it's not too late. You can have the conversation at any time and sit down with somebody and say, what is the best way to communicate with you so that you understand the most and take the most information away? In having that back and forth dialogue and conversation, you're not only showing that you want to communicate the proper way, but you show that you care for your employee and what their needs are. Now, that's only half the battle. After you learn what they need, it's up to you as a leader to put that into place and make sure you're using those proper communication styles. I'm going to throw a caveat here on this one. There are times where you have very large priorities or large changes that have to be communicated. Your employee tells you email is the best way to communicate with me. Get me those large priorities and changes, even though that may be the way they prefer, it's not necessarily the way that it will be effective to communicate a change that way. Those require two-way dialogues, information sharing, questions to be asked, and just an email could hurt a priority like that. So my advice, when anything is large scale, anything really needs to be communicated, extremely clear and effective as it drives change or drives a new culture in an organization, have that conversation face to face or in a meeting or virtually like we are right now first. After you've done that, it is 100% okay to follow up with those expectations via the other ways that somebody likes to be communicated to, like that email.
So when you look at styles and communication styles and stuff, do you use something like a Myers-Briggs or one of those other services to kind of understand what it is or what a person's learning and communication style is? Do you find that effective, or do you feel just that open dialogue at the beginning, asking them how they want to be communicated, is a much better approach to take?
Yes, so we do absolutely use a tool here at PuzzleHR, and the tool that we use is similar to other personality profiles that are out there. We use a company called Omnia. And what that does is really communicates all of those ins and outs for how people like to be communicated to and what their strengths and challenges would be as an employee, how assertive they are, what their personality really looks like. The really cool thing about a tool like Omnia is it's not this is what's written on your tombstone. It's this is what your strong preference is when you're communicating in business, for leadership, for sales. Anyone has the opportunity to tweak those preferences based on what's happening in the business today. But when you look at somebody overall, you can take a look at an assessment like that and say, yeah, this is exactly how I do need to communicate. And when you have that conversation on the side, vast majority of the time, they'll affirm what you read in that assessment. I will say, because PuzzleHR uses Omnia, I'm a little biased to that one myself. But what you mentioned with Myers-Briggs, discs, all those other items, there are some great things that are in there that will give you that type of feedback too.
Moving to a different place, I mean, one of the things that you hear about is the main reason why people will leave a company is because they don't feel that they have upward potential within that company because of that lack of communication. Can you talk a little bit about when should that communication start? How should that communication take place in terms of the direction a person has or the future a person has within a company or organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me, before I answer the question, say that there was actually a really good article that I was reading on SHRM.org not too long ago. And there's a very scary statistic that's in there. This is data acquired from over 21,000 exit interviews across 175 organizations. And that is in 2023, about 27% of US workers quit their jobs. And when you look at a stat like that, across the US, that costs trillions of dollars. But specifically to the folks watching this, when you're replacing somebody, that cost to you is roughly 6 to 9 months of that person's salary. So now is more important than ever to really have those discussions on what does your career look like? Because the two top rated issues, Ken, you mentioned one of them, It's that lack of career opportunities or development. And number two is a work-life imbalance. Let's specifically just talk on the career opportunities and development right now to the question. My personal path and what I learned from a great mentor in his name is Ricardo Jimenez, for anyone that knows, still my mentor to this day from back when I was at AT&T, is you always have the conversations regularly and ongoing. When a person joins up my team or my organization, the first 90 days, I don't bridge that conversation right away. Because in those first 90 days, really want to make sure they're getting acclimated. They're brand new. Their brain is on fire. It's getting pulled in a lot of different directions, and we need to be very directive in guiding them how to do the job that they're hired to do. Once we notice they start coming off of that phase of, oh, this is really hard, I don't know if I can get it, and they start to go into their norm of, okay, I understand now. I'm seeing how this operates, how this functions day in, day out. They start becoming, for lack of better terms, that productive member of society. That's when I start having that conversation of, hey, you're doing really, really great. Here's opportunities we may have. And by the way, one of my jobs is to find out, where do you see yourself and where do you want to go within this organization, within this channel? When they tell you what their aspirations are, it's up to you to start working with them to give them development opportunities to reach that. A lot of those opportunities will be on the employee to take, go out, learn, and do what they need to do to get that information, but you can help facilitate that growth as early as when they start having that normal production.
So then that leads to, I mean, we understand then why it's important to have these kind of conversations, and why it's important to invest in development. But what are some of the traps, in your opinion, or in your experience, you've seen, or where companies kind of fall short on that in terms of, developing their employees? And what can some companies do in order to try to improve that?
So again, there's a few things I'll really pop out at point of mind here on this one. First one, the elephant in the room, is that perceived lack of time. I don't know if I have time to put in development efforts for the employee. I don't know if I can do this because I have all of these priorities that are over here. And let's face it, it's an understandable concern for a lot of businesses. It's hard to find employees. And because it's hard to find employees, that's why I encourage that it's so much more important to find that time to show the development for the employee. And there's a few different ways you can do this. You have opportunities such as micro learnings, we call them, where you don't necessarily have to sit in a classroom for 2, 4, 6 hours. You have a 15-minute session. You have a 30-minute session. Find time to carve out an hour or so of development at least each month for your employees. And that doesn't mean taking everybody off the floor at the same time. What it means is, hey, we've got a few employees here, a few here, a few here. Divvy that up. Give that development on a regular basis and help find the time, because you'll find as you lose employees because they leave for not having development opportunities, you'll have even less time than you do today. So that retention becomes important. Number two that I'll talk to on here is resistance to change. Companies, and this is my least favorite phrase you could ever say to me. So if you see me in public, please don't say this. You'll see my eye start to twitch, a vein pops out right here. You hear things like, that's the way it's always been, so that's the way it's going to be. We've always had, this is your training, here's your job, go, go, go. If your resistance to change is getting in the way of getting extra development for folks, unfortunately, you're going to help move those folks out the door. And very similarly, you have frontline employees that may seem that they're resistant to change. They may seem that they don't want to learn a new task or a new area. And the biggest approach with that, and for leadership that's resistant to putting it in place, is the WIFM. What's in it for me? If you fully articulate, hey, as a leader, putting this development project in place is going to get you higher retention rates, happier employees, people that are more engaged. On the other side, you go to that frontline employee and say, hey, this is going to help you drive A, B, or C priority, get you better in this area, and tie it to what their goal is in the organization for where they want to be. They see why it benefits them, and they go, oh, this is to help make me better, not to just check a box and say that I was in training. And then number three is that overall engagement as a whole. You have to keep your employees engaged. You have different levels of engagement, right? So you can have somebody that's completely disengaged, You have that person that does the, hey, here's my status quo. I'm at the bar. Everything is good. Then you have your overachievers. In keeping that engagement, driving those opportunities to get better helps to keep them at that level, helps to take them out of a level of disengagement or just being at the norm and want to succeed because number one, they see why it benefits the organization, see why it benefits them, and they can see themselves doing it. I'll ask a kind of a hypothetical question here, and that is for anyone that's out there, have you ever had a leader that's just given you, here's your pile of paperwork, go do this, audit these papers, audit these contracts, and then wanders off, and you go, oh, this is a lot of busy work that I don't want to do. You don't see the value in what that is. There's no engagement for it. But if I'm that same leader and I have that pile of paperwork that needs to be audited, and I say, hey, I have some really, really important information that we need to audit. Unfortunately, we've discovered that there was a glitch in the back end of the system, and a couple of the pieces of information that are on here didn't transfer over the right way. We need to find those that didn't transfer because if it doesn't transfer right, completely destroys the customer experience. We know that one of our top goals is have the highest rated customer experience in our industry. I need your help on this. Can you help to make sure that customer experience stays great? You've got a path. You understand that why what you're doing is important, and you have the engagement there. Factors like this really, really drive that overall employee experience.
When you talk about engagement, and we actually, similar to what you said, we kind of look at it as a visitor, a renter, or an owner, same sort of mentality. Is it really the goal of organizations to try to continue to migrate people up? So convert visitors to renters, renters to owners, and owners to, in our case, partners or whatever? Or at what point in time do you look at that and say, well, this person really isn't going to work out here as a visitor, and maybe we need to cut bait? I mean, where does that conversation take place, and where does that? I mean, yes, we're supposed to be talking about development here, but you also have to assess who's you have the ability to develop and who you don't.
Yes, so few directions I can go on this one as well. The first one I'll talk about is one that I will say either someone's with me or against me on this one. I don't think there's much gray area for it. I am a huge proponent, and I have talked about this for a long, long time, that not everyone necessarily will or should have the goal to keep walking up that corporate ladder. There are some folks within an organization that are really, really good frontline producers. And those folks, if they don't want to be in that leadership, they don't want that next level, they are fully engaged and they are extremely happy with what they do. If we try to force that move up, that will become a person that is disengaged and no longer wants to be there. So we could drive a really, really good producer right out the door by doing that. My methodology has always been if you're articulating to me that you want this position, you want to stay here, you absolutely love what you do, I 100% support you, and I'm going to help to make you the best in that position ever and be able to at times tap on your shoulder to say, hey, someone over here is struggling. You think you can help them out to get them to where you are, or help get them to the next level with this priority or this item that you're really, really good at? That drives engagement for that type of person. Now, on the other hand, you did ask, I think you used the term Fisher cut bait, which is one of my favorite terms as well. Unfortunately, in leadership, there's some not so fun stuff we have to do. Sometimes one of those things is making the choice to part ways with somebody from an organization. It's unavoidable. I have had to let people go in my career, no matter how good or bad of a leader I have been. When you look at it, what we really need to make sure we're doing is have clear and concise communication on what the expectations are overall for all of our employees. After we've set that clear and concise expectation, we need to continuously follow up on what those expectations are. And then you, of course, have your review period at the end of that as well. So if you're not following up, you're not reviewing, you're not looking at everything holistically, you're not overviewing what's going on in the business, it would be unfair to say this person isn't cutting it. Because if you just set an expectation and then, oh, expectation not met, this person has to go, you could be getting rid of a really, really good person. So this is where that importance of follow-up and feedback comes into play. Now, if you're consistently following up, you're giving feedback, you're holding a standard of accountability, and ensuring that folks know and have committed to what the proper expectations are, and they're still not making the choice to do that, that's where, yes, you do have to go through that performance process. And unfortunately, that means somebody leaves an organization. One thing I will add to the end of that, Ken, is when you call it what it is, you write somebody up. It's not the nail in the coffin. That should not meant to ever be something where you say, you're in trouble, you did this wrong. Instead, it is a step where you're helping to plan with that person how to overcome what is happening. Give them every opportunity to get off of that and move forward with growth in the organization. If they continue to make the choice to not take those proper steps, yes, we do have to cut ties. But at times you may see a lack of communication caused that, a lack of accountability caused it. It could be something on our end as leaders that isn't quite connecting with that employee. So it's giving every benefit of the doubt first, but not taking too long with it because you cannot sacrifice a business or a client experience with anything like that.
So now you talked about fostering ownership mentality and trying to help develop and promote people up to that ownership spot, in essence, in terms of when you talk about ownership, it's ownership of the job or responsibility or the task or whatever. What's the best way for you to do that? How do you go and help people to get to the point where they have that ownership mentality? Is that something that's innate, or is that something that you can foster?
You can foster that. With some people, I will say there's a subset of people that are out there that immediately try to take ownership of absolutely everything, always want to be that rock star. Some people, you have to foster that type of behavior. And what it comes down to is clear and concise vision from leadership. If you have a leadership chain in an organization, they're probably going to have or should have their top two or three really, really big priorities that everything in the company drives to. So if you have a department of 6 people, and then your coworker has a department of 6 people, multiple different departments, and everyone's just running around doing everything with hair on fire, and it's not driving to those top priorities, you don't have people that have a capability to take ownership of that. From leadership, from the top down, communicate clearly what those top priorities are as an organization. Hey, as a company, this is what we're driving towards. Here's our vision. Here's why we're doing this. Everything you do needs to tie to these three. Your leadership chains down the ladder, then look and say, okay, everything I put out for my team has to tie to one of these three priorities. If it does not, I can't put that out as a priority. As you're communicating to your frontline employees why they're given the tasks that they're given, why they're given their performance goals, it's tying it to, hey, because this is our top level priority, here's what I have for your next performance goal. Here's why it's important, and here's how it ties to that. When you foster the importance of how it drives success for the organization and really, really get people involved in that head, heart, hands model, they understand it. Their heart's in it because they're helping the company, helping their coworkers, and their hands are in it. You're going to foster that ownership mentality and foster a higher level of accountability across an organization.
So when we talk about the top overarching organizational level, and then you start filtering it down, departmentally, you might have, I mean, I could see a company-wide priority is kind of broad-based, right? And then as you get departmentally and get closer and closer to that line, it's going to become more finite in terms of what we do for this group or that group or another group or sales or marketing or direct service or whatever. I can see how they all tie in, but should everybody have their own then subcategory of those top priorities and then work through their top priorities within their department or their house or their whatever?
Great question. So I'll look at this in that granular perspective. The answer is kind of. So yes, there will be subsets of priorities or missions depending on teams, but those priorities can always tie to that top level goal. So for example, if we have a top level goal of being best in class customer service for all companies in the CPA realm. Let's just go very broad on this one. We go all the way to that frontline level. And we've discovered that between accounting and back-end business, there's a fundamental gap in communication. And we need somebody to fix that gap in communication because what it's doing is causing a poor customer experience overall. That poor customer experience doesn't tie with world-class customer experience. So the performance goal is now to devise a new communication path and let's say project management path between that accounting and back-end business operations to close the gap in what we have and make sure we're solving for the problem of that customer experience going down. In doing that, it's your own little departmental goal or bi-departmental goal in this case that you're working to solve for, but it ties directly to that world-class customer experience. So absolutely, it can get granular to the point of team level, but it always ties to one of those top priorities.
So speaking of granular level, I'm going to go back to something we talked about earlier about learning and development. And you said that it might make sense to have, instead of 2-hour meetings or 2-hour trainings, small micro trainings and things like that. I find that a lot of companies, a lot of organizations, it's like a one size fits all. They try to give everybody the same training. Talk to me a little bit about whether that makes sense, or how do you target the training maybe better for each individual employee's needs?
Really, really nuanced for this one. So there's a couple of different paths on this. If you have something that's coming out as a training initiative, a lot of times you'll be able to focus in on this area that is the same for absolutely everybody. So all people across the company have this one specific path they have to take for X, Y, or Z process. That being said, not every part of that organization follows just that. You have finance that has this extra subset. You have sales that has this extra subset. So what we look at in cases like that, when you can have an overall training that encompasses everything, absolutely do it. But have those smaller breakout trainings afterwards. So let's say a master training is an hour or an hour and a half long, but you have to look at that finance team and say, hey, we need to take you aside in 2 weeks before this launches and give you your smaller training on the nuances for your team so they clearly understand it. That's an absolutely great way to get it to happen because you don't want the entire organization sitting through a finance training that they don't necessarily need to have. So breaking out to those subsets is huge, and it doesn't always need to be in person. I will tell you that we've gone through a lot of changes at PuzzleHR. I won't bore you with what those changes are, but a lot of back-end process changes. One of them a couple of years ago being huge, which is changing the email platform we use. That's a fundamental change, and some people had a hard time with it. So we had live in-person training for an hour to an hour and a half for the entire organization. We then had some small departmental trainings that happened between sales and operations and benefits to see how they use it for their teams. And then we took that extra step of, you know what? We need to give continued tips. So we had what was called the front tip of the day, that each and every single day for about a 3-week period, a new video came out saying, hey, this is the common question we're getting right now. Here's how you solve for that common question. And it became a frequently asked question database of videos that to this day still gets used for that platform. So it's really bleeding a lot of different things in there to make sure that we're hitting all of the needs of what the employees need and what the company needs to succeed.
And I'm assuming when you're talking about these trainings, it's not just technical training, but then there's also the soft skill training that people need, especially in that leadership role.
Yes, absolutely. So that soft skill training comes in a few different ways. So I am a huge proponent of face-to-face training for those soft skills. I don't necessarily think that sitting in an LMS or learning management system and having something that is pre-recorded or read this slide and take a test is necessarily the best bet. If you can watch in one of those trainings and you can be part of a live training for it, it is so important because you have the opportunity to engage how adults learn. 10% of how we learn as adults is just sitting down and reading a book or looking at a seminar. Another 20% is that interaction or exposure. You can see somebody doing something, talk back and forth with an expert on it, and really gain that information. The other 70% It's experience. It's getting your hands dirty and actually doing what needs to be done. So in those trainings, yes, either a small micro training, an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours to get a little longer. You take the time to take one topic, have a strongly facilitated topic where you can have somebody in leadership talk back and forth with you. The person facilitating should be talking about 60% of the time. Audience talks about 40% of the time. That's a strong way to get those skills. And then you look at LMS or learning management system again, based trainings to follow up on it. Look at a seminar to follow up. Or most important, walk away at the very end saying, this is what I need to put into place to drive that cultural change. One thing that we'll have in common with every single training opportunity that you can ever look at, never look at training as check the box, I've done this. Look at training as at the end, this is what I need to put into place to drive that cultural change or drive that technical change in an organization to take the time that was put into it, make sense and matter to the company.
Yeah, I mean, I find that for me, and I don't know if I'm the norm or not the norm, but I need that real world experience. I need to connect what I'm learning with what I'm doing. And if I can connect with what I'm learning with what I'm doing, I own it. But if I can't make that connection, so that's why a lot of times it's really, really tough when you're dealing with theory as opposed to practice. And as you said, getting your hands dirty and getting involved in the work so that you can kind of see where how that training kind of fits.
No, absolutely. It's that overall experience. It just becomes so important for that. And if you don't have that, you're losing out on so much of how the adults learn.
The other thing you mentioned earlier is you said, and this goes back to, when you think about how people spend their time within an organization or within a company, a lot of times leadership, they spend running around with their hair on fire, trying to put out fires within the organization. And I think, when you look at development and growth of your staff, there's a kind of a balance that I think you have to strike between setting expectations for what you're trying to accomplish and then also being able to set aside the time, the energy, effort, dollars, everything else in order to accomplish those expectations. How do you go about doing that?
So there's a lot of conversation. I can talk to you for about 2 hours on this one if you want to.
Well, we only have about
We
12
have
minutes
that
left.
time. I'm going to keep this well under 12 minutes then. So first thing that is always important to me is you are setting hyper clear and realistic goals. One of those big downfalls that causes hair to be on fire and not having those high expectations met is we weren't clear enough in our goals as leaders. And what I mean by clarity is essentially you're giving every bit of detail on this, not to a micromanaging point, depending on the level of development of that person. You're looking at here's where we are for a current status, here's where we need to be, here's the time we need to be here. The path we need to take is develop this platform, develop this communication, increase this skill set that we have. Whatever the overall goal is and what that path is, it needs to be clearly lined out. There also needs to be the opportunity for the employee to say, I understand, and you get them to commit to that, or I don't understand, or I need more information. The more we can be clear in that initial setting of expectations is the more success we can have overall with driving those expectations in the back end of the business. Number two is really providing adequate resources. So when we've set the goal, people need to know, hey, what kind of budget do I have? Where do I go for the information that I need? Who else am I partnering with? Who should I come to if X, Y, or Z happens? They have those resources and know how to use them. Of course, it drives the success again of the overall project. Next portion I'm going to say is probably one of the most important things I will say today. If you've taken nothing else from me today and you think I'm a complete kook, I promise this one is really big for you. You have to follow up on your expectations. And when you do so, you are inspecting, but you are not inspecting with your ears. You're inspecting with your eyes. You can ask anybody, hey, how are you doing on that project? How are you doing on our new imperative? And the answer is really good. Everything's on schedule. But the second you say, show me how we're doing, that changes the game. At that point, you're looking at everything from start to finish. So when I talk following up on expectations and looking at it with your eyes, not just doing it at the end of the project, you need set regular intervals that you look at. By doing that, you show that you care and you show that you're looking for the expectations that you set out. And finally, it's really tailoring the support to the individual's needs. If I am a functional expert in something we're changing or something we're driving forward, I don't need my hand held the whole time. That being said, if somebody's newer to a type of project, this is their first time doing anything like we've set forth for them, they're going to need more directive behavior, more directive leadership. Guide them in the right path, give them the path that they need, and allow them to learn and move along the way. So, really, with balancing the expectations, in some of these, you can be a little more hands off and go through the inspection points as people bring to you. Others, if you know somebody's brand new at somebody, or at something, I should say, if you don't have the time for that hand holding or perceive you don't have the time for it, might not be the right person for that imperative. So you have to balance out all of these things very, very carefully and make sure that that right support is there. If you can't provide the right support and somebody is going to need it, I promise you, you're setting up that project or that change for a failure.
I mean, one of the concerns that I have often is, again, when you have different people and people have different skill sets and people have different levels of expertise, you also have to try to find that balance between, giving them the rope in essence to learn and potentially, I don't want to say hang themselves, but whatever. But then also the whole aspect of micromanaging people when you don't want people to feel like you're micromanaging them. So it's kind of a delicate balance that has to come into play here in terms of how you kind of go through that monitoring or inspection process, as you put it.
Yes, no, absolutely. It's very delicate because if you have a functional expert and you're asking every single day or every hour, where's the update? Where do we stand with this? Where do we stand with this? That's not going to feel good to that person. But you have to understand that complete opposite spectrum, somebody that's newer to something, they need more help. They need you to be there for them and they need you to provide that instruction or guidance. So when I talk on following up on expectations, there's a specific path I'll illustrate for you right now. Let's say you give that overall clear expectation. They know exactly what the expectation is. When you're setting that, give them the path of when you reach this milestone, this milestone, this milestone, however many you determine, bring what you've done to me. We'll look at it together and we'll see what's ready for the next step. At that point, you'll have an opportunity to give micro course corrections. You'll look at everything that's in there and say, okay, this part right here, what do you think we could do different? How could we tweak this to be more in line with what the end goal is? Work together to make it a project to move forward and learn with, and have that really, really high degree of success with. Give them their wins. In doing that, you're giving every opportunity for them to learn, but you're not allowing that rope to be too long to cause damage because inevitably there's going to be course corrections that happen. Let's take out those inspection points and take a look at how it feels. Here's your project. Everything is clearly set for expectations. Go get them, Tiger. They come to you at the end with a fully complete project that they're really proud of because they finished it. And all of a sudden, you look like the teacher that everyone dreaded that pulled out the red pen and started putting X's everywhere across that project. You may have something that could have been course corrected in the very beginning, but because it continued through the whole way, you got to start a project again. You've wasted time, and more importantly, you have damaged a relationship with that person and made them feel inadequate in something that they were doing. They feel like they've failed. Now, I'll talk very candidly about failure. It happens. I've probably failed more than I've succeeded, as many people listening to this probably have too. It is okay to fail because it's not a failure as long as you learn from it. But if we have a way to minimize that with inspection points, to just have course corrections versus a catastrophic failure, you're doing the right thing for that employee to learn and get recognized for all the good that they're doing throughout that project versus, oh, all this is wrong at the very end.
So you're really talking then about maybe changing some aspects of organizational culture to kind of create a culture of continuous learning throughout the entire organization and all aspects of the organization towards meeting common goals that are established at the top.
Absolutely, 100% on par.
So, so having said that, I guess my question is, how should organizations, I know you talked about a bunch of different things now, but what are the key elements, the couple key elements that organizations with the couple minutes we have left should put in place in order to be able to kind of develop that culture that we're looking for here?
So you mentioned a very, very key word of culture. I always encourage a culture of learning from the top down. And I'll give a message and I'll use the word Radio Shack. Anyone remember Radio Shack? It's
Batteries.
kind of, yeah, batteries. Do you want batteries? Do you want a cell phone with that? It's Radio Shack kind of stopped changing and stopped growing. They focused in, and I can speak to this because I supported Radio Shack from an AT&T standpoint long, long ago. They focused in on what they would do the same every single day. They didn't have that culture of continuous learning overall. If there is continuous learning, which comes continuous change, they could have continued to adapt and grow within that technology space and still been around today. If you're not growing and you're not changing, you might be stalling, and that becomes very, very dangerous. So set up that culture from the very start of a culture of learning and a culture of developing new ideas. And one thing that I think was very, very hard for me being younger in leadership was taking those ideas from other people. As a leader, I felt I always needed the answers. I needed my idea put in place. I needed my stuff implemented. That's not the case. Now that I've gotten a little bit older and a lot more gray hair up here, maybe a little bald spot back here, I've realized I need to be smart enough to look at my team and say, ooh, that's a really good idea. I need to help you get that in place and give them the credit for getting that in place. If you have a culture where it's okay to share your ideas, people aren't going to hear things like stay in your lane. That's for management to worry about. If they have the freedom to share what they feel can make an organization better, you realize that's really good and you can help drive that initiative for other people. You have a culture that's really, really hard to beat. Number two on that one that I put in place for that fostering a continuous culture of learning is reward and recognize your people. Absolutely have to recognize people. In fact, my path is 80%, and I recommend this to everyone, 80% of those feedback conversations need to be, this is where we were really good. 20% are the areas of improvement. What I encourage every single leader out there to do, every single day, go out on your floors, get on Zoom, get anywhere. Catch somebody doing something right. Thank them for what they do and why it drives the organization, and watch the smile on that person's face. Rewarded behavior is repeated behavior. You catch people doing something right on a daily basis, they will want to be in your charge and want to learn the new items and want to be developed and stick with that organization overall because they feel valued.
So with the last 30 seconds of your time, what are some key traits that leaders need to excel in order to effectively develop the strategies we've been talking about today?
Key traits that people need to develop these strategies are number one, understanding. We have to understand and be empathetic as leaders. If you can be an empathetic leader, you will have a much easier time in growth and development. Number two, be okay with change, but be hyper clear on the communications with that change. Always focus on that what's in it for me. And number three, overall, again, it's that communication I ended with change. If you cannot be a clear communicator and make sure everyone has that clear communication path and understand where they are going, you are going to have a hard time keeping folks engaged and a hard time keeping folks in your organization.
Awesome. So thank you, Jarrid. I mean, this was really, really good. I took a bunch of notes on this myself. I'm going to try to incorporate some of these into my own leadership style. And hopefully everybody got something out of this like I did. Before we wrap up, I just want to remind everybody to mark your calendars for next month's Cerini Connection, which is taking place on November 14th. We'll be discussing cyber wellness with Daniel Ford from Jovia. So we hope to see you there. And thanks for attending today. And we look forward to seeing you next month. Oh, and tell your friends about this. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jarrid. This was awesome. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, everyone. Pleasure to be here.